Good evening. Welcome. I'm delighted to open tonight's program, our first Spotlight on Design lecture for the fall season, featuring architect Nader Tehrani. Tonight is also our inaugural Edward A. Feiner Lecture for Public Architecture. I'm Diane Taylor, Director of Public Programs here at the National Building Museum. The museum was established by an act of Congress in 1980 and serves as the nation's museum to the built environment. Our mission is to inspire curiosity about the world we design and build. For more than 2 decades, the museum's Spotlight on Design series has hosted some of the greatest minds in architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and design right here in this great hall. It's an opportunity to explore the creative journeys and influences of those who not only shape, but characterize the world around us. Nader Tehrani's work and unique perspective continues to spark new ways of seeing and understanding the profound relationship between ourselves and the places we inhabit. Before we dive into tonight's program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a few individuals and organizations whose support makes this series possible. I'd like to thank our wonderful museum staff who are so dedicated to making public dialogue like this possible. I'd like to thank all of our museum members as well as our Capital Society corporate members in our audience. I'd like to extend our appreciation to the presenting sponsor for the Spotlight on Design series, the Anthony and Keiko Greenberg Foundation. Additional support is provided by the American Institute of Architects and the Edward A. Feiner Fund for Public Architecture. Finally, before welcoming Nader, I'd like to thank and introduce 2 very special architects, Chris Morrison and Casey Jones of Perkins & Will. Casey Jones is the Principal and Chief Design Officer of Perkins & Will and has spearheaded the efforts to establish the Edward A. Feiner Fund for Public Architecture. I'd like to invite Chris and Casey to share about the legacy of Ed and the significance of today's lecture, which is held in his name.
Many of you knew Ed, and so for those of you who didn't, he struck a very striking profile. He had a flat top that was meticulously trimmed at all times. He could be seen in his cowboy boots and his aviator glasses. Ed fulfilled many different roles in his career, and personally for me and for many of us, I think he served as a mentor, as an advocate, and as a friend. And it's in that spirit that I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to kick this off tonight. Ed Feiner's dedication to design excellence and innovation defined his illustrious career. Ed rose to prominence in the United States as the chief architect of the United States General Services Administration, the federal agency responsible for the design, construction, and operation of courthouses, border stations, agency headquarters, and other key civic facilities. His work, which included more than 150 government buildings over the course of 24 years, reinvigorated federal architecture and brought prestige to a new generation of national landmarks. At Perkins & Will, Ed created our design leadership group, which focuses on the firm's established and emerging design talent. Through a well-designed program of review and critique, Ed positively impacted our people and our projects. For Ed, a culture of sustained excellence was always the goal, which he defined as the design-led, high-performing, innovative practice. He cared as passionately about good proportion and beauty as he did about sustainability and inclusive design. He challenged everyone to produce work that lifted people up and made the world a better place. Casey?
Thank you. I have the great pleasure of thanking the National Building Museum for the sponsorship of this talk. I can think of no better institution, or quite frankly, better space for this conversation to be held. So very much looking forward to Nader's remarks shortly. There are a couple of people who need to be thanked specifically for the event tonight. Perkins and Will was the lead donor, but this would not have happened without the generous contribution of everyone that you see listed here. Specifically, I want to note that Tom Main and Blythe Main were early contributors to the cause. Moshe Softy was himself very generous. Layman Smith McLeish, who's present here tonight, Lears Weinzappel, Robert A.M. Stern, architects. If you are familiar with the world of architecture, in addition to the firms listed here and the individuals, you will see that it is a very diverse group of people who come at the profession from a range of perspectives and ideologies. And I think that's the remarkable thing about Ed Feiner, that through his work and through the work of the General Services Administration and his subsequent career in private practice, he was really able to build a broad community of architects. And the talk tonight celebrates that legacy. Thank you. I'd like to invite Diane to come back up to the stage and introduce Nader.
Now it is my honor to introduce Nader Tehrani. Nader is the principal architect of NADAAA, an interdisciplinary practice whose work spans infrastructure, urbanism, architecture, and installations, operating at scales from city planning to fabrication. Known for projects that reshape their context and carve out spaces for social engagement, Nader's designs balance material craft, disciplined tectonics, and inventive detailing. Nader received the American Academy of Arts and Letters Arnold W. Brunner Memorial Prize, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States, for his contributions to architecture as an art. He is also an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Design, and recipient of the Design Visionary Award from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. The former head of the Department of Architecture at MIT, Tehrani was also Dean of the School of Architecture of the Cooper Union, where Ed Feiner studied. Nader's work is featured in the permanent collections of the CCA and the Nasher Sculpture Center. His work has been widely exhibited at the MoMA, LA MoCA, and the Venice Biennale. Nader, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the museum.
Thank you for this incredibly generous invitation and introduction. It's really wonderful to have all of you here, especially those who I know well, and some of you who've been my students, and certainly others that I've met tonight. I prepared this talk for tonight, knowing that the topic of the public realm was something of importance for Ed, but also recognizing that we have not done a significant amount of public projects, though all of them, even residential ones, have a public dimension to them, that one has to come to a reckoning of some sorts about how you position architecture, not so much as objects, but as something that is in dialogue with a larger urban context, a public realm, and a sense of the civic. The diminishing public, of course, refers to what lies out there, the dangers, things that we have been witnessing, not recently, but something that people of my generation have seen. But as we go through school and we go through precedents and peruse through different cultures, one is always somehow captivated by these large projects that seem outside of the permissible range of a single author. These grand urban spaces, whether in Iran or in the United States or in Europe, but reminding ourselves that there is always a tension between the form and the formless. I'm showing Tokyo there on the right because it is a formidable public space, and yet it is formless. And to some degree, that also maps out the tension between what we do, let's say as architects, to specify form, but what we do as people, as humans, is we occupy spaces, and more often than not, we do to spaces what the architects don't want us to do to it. So that tension produces what I would say is a very positive livelihood of those spaces that are otherwise completely composed and in some ways civil in terms of their layout. The tension between form and formlessness also comes into dialogue as we go through a public process where participatory design may be required, or in areas where people don't have access to public funding in the first place. Compositionally, if you like, these two projects are very similar, though one cannot underline how different they are in terms of conception, administration, delivery. On the left, Caracas, one of the ranchos that is just outside of the valley looking into the city. No infrastructure, if any, maybe some water here or there. And the other one, of course, Safdie's habitat, which insinuates the informal, but of course has to go through extraordinary means to individualize the presence of identity for each one in the swarm, as it were. A roundabout, not of any significance until the revolution begins. This is Tahrir Square. You've seen it all on TV if you haven't visited it yourself. And it takes on different forms depending on morning or night. But that circle, for the most part, though symbolically powerful, is at the end of the day a traffic interchange. It is an infrastructural amenity, hardly a civic dimension to it. But what I'd like to argue for also is given the amount of funds that go into infrastructure, into highways, into sewage systems, into all sorts of other kinds of spaces of engineering, why we cannot invest in them the kind of identity that is deserved of public projects of a certain kind. And so that is lurking behind some of these themes. Here, I won't speak to this, just suffice it to say it is of my culture in Iran. Shahyad Square, it was originally called during the Shah's period. It was more than just a roundabout, totally not integrated into the city, but it was the gateway into the city from Mehrabad, the airport, and served much later as a symbolic core, the center of the revolution that eventually toppled the Shah. Again, the idea that architecture or urbanism is the platform for major cultural dialogue and exchange. So this segues into the Daniels faculty, another roundabout, dangerous one. Many people would get run over here, some in terrible ways, and yet with the emergence of Richard Sommer as its dean for the Daniels faculty, the School of Architecture and Landscape in Toronto, it emerged as our site of intervention for what would become what is today a very integrated school between the various disciplines. And part of the idea was to transform it first into not so much a vehicular space, but a slower space of pedestrians, and then find a way to occupy the periphery in a way that is legitimate, slow, and flexible enough to expand. And I'll try to go fast in some of these sequences because it's pretty self-explanatory. Knox College, a U-shaped neo-Gothic building over 100 years old, eventually emerged with a series of additions which didn't amount to much, needed to be demolished in order to identify its core properties, that is the corridor that defines the courtyard. Our strategy with a very, very limited budget was to complete that in the most economic fashion and then bring the circulation around, giving a north face to a building that never had one, establishing its cores at the four corners, and then framing a civic space, not quite as civic as the one we're in right now, but something that brings everybody together, not just for lectures, but for classes, for exhibitions, range of other things, and then begins to insinuate what happens at the periphery. For those of you who know Toronto, you know some of the characteristic oval and circular spaces. Spadina Circle or Spadina Crescent is one of those spaces, anchored on the south side by the steeple of Knox College, and something that they wanted to maintain intact as part of their cone of view or cone of vision, thus making a building that, while architecture is also predisposed towards a landform, a kind of landscape extension that allows the building to evolve as different wings are added on in the future, maintaining the view of the tower. With incredible setbacks and restrictions, also part of this was to find a kind of a la planning, a kind of zoning set of setbacks that mimic in a very different way the corners and the pavilions of the existing building in the round, recognizing that while symbolically the north and south elevation of this building are its front, the practical front doors is on the east and the west. The east being where the campus is, and the west being where the students live in the Kensington neighborhoods. And so an inner pedestrian street plays a significant role in activating the site, but by extension also recognizing that no matter the objecthood of this building in the center, sectionally something needs to happen within the building such that it breathes, it is able to leak out and engage the very public realm that promises to motivate the building. And so the plaza, for instance, is on the east edge of the building, recognizing that the door, as it were, is at the crack between the old and the new building. The inner street mobilizes all of the public areas of the building and is open 24/7, a cafe, the lockers, auditorium, library, fab lab, et cetera, but also gives you a promised view penetrating the building all the way to Spadina North. And that remains open, with having a kind of keyed entry to the School of Architecture as you get to the second floor and so forth. And so that crack is part of the experience of the building. The view north penetrates the cafe area, looking down through the Fab Lab, back towards the street, and then out towards a fabrication terrace, and then to a landscape that ended up becoming the main classroom, of course, during COVID, where nobody was allowed to assemble on the inside. And of course, though not part of our commission, the kind of truth and reconciliation process that Canada was undergoing at that time became part of its manifestation in the north facade as the building gained prominence on this site. Working with Public Work, the landscape architecture firm, a lot of the strategies had to do with incrementalizing each quadrant, understanding a form of responsiveness that activated those spaces, diagonally cutting it into the east, west, north, and south, and then beginning to work on each island independently, but also as an integrated space. And as you can see, asymmetrical, loaded in ways that both acknowledge the axiality of the boulevard, but also the other and eccentric ways in which this was meant to work, with surface vegetation types in existing tree canopy, and to reinforce that with other forms of shade as one goes around, pushing people as much through the building, but also through its periphery. And I won't go into all of the details, but the chapter of each of these quadrants is part of the narrative of a traffic island essentially acquiring a civic dimension. One of the most important things, of course, has to do with the pedagogical space of this building, and the landscape department played a critical role in forming the Grit Lab, which is the landscape on top of the roof where all of the exploration and experimentation happens. But as one navigates in the round, one goes from the main plaza on one side to the amphitheater that is on one of the hills. There's a cut and fill moment as you cut the earth to get into the Fab Lab. The fill forms the kind of outdoor auditorium behind it on the other side, an entry to the west. And then later, at a later phase, the pavilion to the south, the terrace to the south, the alumni terrace that looks back onto Lake Ontario, where you can see the activities of Indigenous people coming to a form of celebration at the moment of truth and reconciliation, a recognition of a public that was hitherto marginalized and now coming into recognition. Now, the core of the building, what used to be the courtyard, is also the darkest space of the project. And so the question was, how do you bring a public dimension to an interior? And how do you bring light into it? Part of that was an idea of looking towards a different kind of uncanny space. Here we borrowed from Agam to create a kind of space on the interior that kept changing in terms of its color as one walked around. Divisible by three, it could become 3 classrooms, but also for large lectures. It could leak up into the studio space where there's another informal auditorium that borrows light, that brings the northern light back into that space, and then looks back onto Spadina North. As a side narrative, I should say that this was also deemed unbuildable by the contractors, though in our minds a simple concrete shell, a ruled surface. There's no reason why this couldn't be built given the work of Felix Candela, but after it was deemed over $1 million over budget, everyone suggested a nice flat roof with some round skylights. And so on one of my trips to Melbourne, I said, well, why don't we try to build this in the context of our own studio out of a stick system, basically a steel frame, and then use a bottom layer that is basically a radiant panel, cooling, of course, because the cooling will descend. And it turned out that that did save us some $800,000 and the approval to unleash the project, which has a kind of proportional relationship, if you like, to Crown Hall, but beyond engaging the public in terms of the prospect at the top of the building, looking towards Spadina North or Toronto North. It also recognizes that the public realm is there above us, where natural light and the environment is part of that space, and a space that effectively is part of the affect of the building. It's something that goes beyond it. Anyway, in the context of the form and the formless, naturally the kind of projects we've worked on at RISD, at MIT, the RISD Library, and a marketplace in China, these all are informed, if you like, by strong form. Classical spaces that we know through daily life and through quotidian experiences involve much more complexities than the forms would betray. And so, in many ways, that is what is at work in the convolution, if you like, of the orders that you see in the landscape. What had not anticipated at that point the protests of the last 2 years. In fact, the building that you see on the right is not on this circle. It's on the other island just to the east. Now, for those of you old enough to remember, this is the image to which I arrived in the United States. I was here for 1 semester when the revolution started happening. And these are the images that we would see in the New York Times. The reality is that some 5-10 years before this, a series of infrastructural projects started gaining fashion inside Tehran because it was a city with incredibly horrendous traffic. And these prefabricated Belgian bridges were brought in and installed sometimes in less than 2 months to allow people to get to their places of work during the day. These became the places of revolution. And because they gave a kind of prospect over the city, they became ways in which physically people could manifest the power of the people. And remember, this is before the Islamic era. The revolution was marked at that moment by leftists, by Marxists, by socialists, by even people in fur coats were out there going against the Shah. And this is a kind of pre-technology moment. The revolution happened by cassette. It was through the dissemination of the cassettes that the word of Khomeini eventually took over the message. And when he entered the country, a kind of squashing off of the other, what he considered fringe groups of the revolution, what became the Islamic Revolution eventually. But anyway, the space of infrastructure as a public space, here I'm looking at the orchestrated randomness of suburbia inside James Wines's drawing, but also another image of that amazing moment of an incomplete building during the revolution as it's taken over by the people, as if it were a stadium. And so this harks on our investment in the Tenderham Bridge, our second project in Melbourne, that is only practically used about 2 weeks a year. And it's really only used because of the tennis open there. And so why build a pedestrian bridge that's only going to be used because the volumes of people that go there just make it forbidding to make it functional. And so the real bridge doesn't happen over. The rest of the 50 weeks of the year, it is about an underbelly that speaks to the Yarra Park on the river, the underbelly, and we were working with a technology very familiar to you all about the redundancy of structure that comes through the bending of rebar and the ways in which one can render ambiguous the relationship between main members and supporting members, embodying the figure of the bridge in the maximum moment to create a trellis underneath this bridge that is the threshold into the park. So while there's a threshold that goes above and over the bridge, the most important threshold is what comes underneath and brings the people back down towards the river. And so these are another set of projects that allowed us to play with the idea of infrastructure in a meaningful civic way. On the left side, this is the extension of the Green Line in Somerville around Boston, where the actual station stop is not visible to the street. So they needed a marker of some sort. The tower that you see is part of a marker that lights up at night to identify people where the station is in the first place. In the second, what we were tasked to design, not as architects, but as artists, was the periphery of an electrical station that is let's say, the new center of Austin, where the public library and several other civic buildings are placed next to their river. And in the last image, of course, an exploration on CLT, the gateway into the Venice Biennale from the backside where the Vaporetto stop goes. But the notion that these infrastructural projects are a central part of our daily experience and are deserved of a more civic treatment. The MIT project is one of those types of projects, though a mixed-use building with dormitories, labs, childcare, and many other things. It is formed by an orientation of the main body of the building, what's called Site 4, to allow the Marriott Hotel, another Safdie building, to have a view of the river. But part of this also has to do with the urbanization of the base of the building. At the end of the day, this project is not about a building, it's about a block that is permeable and addresses 4 different sides with contradictory elements, the most important of which arguably is a quad that is not just of the university, but is a threshold between East Cambridge and the Charles River, what brings people together around a commons that brings town and gown together. I won't go into the analysis of the block, but suffice it to say that it involves a much more informed understanding of the incremental and the isolated moments of the site, east, west, north, south, a part of which also includes the gateway to the campus. Those of you who know MIT know the role of the infinite corridor. It's a series of buildings that have an interior street that basically pierces east-west and lands at the threshold of our site. Gateways, of course, are usually penetrated laterally. In other words, it's a short threshold through a wall. Here we were faced with the opposite, a deep threshold that had to be over 150 feet long, that is the depth of essentially the entire block, that is then blocked by all of the head houses of the Red Line subway station. And so part of this project emerges like an iceberg coming from the ground up. The red line connects to Alewife and Braintree on deeper ends, but we had to imagine how some of these things emerge from the ground up, and then doing something atop that is larger than the sum of its parts, a civic gesture that protects and engages the kind of public moment as you navigate that passage into campus. Interestingly, by the way, this entire project was done in different phases, and we didn't understand what phasing exactly meant at that time. We understood that phasing would happen once every 5 to 10 years as different funds become available. It was exactly the opposite. With the low interest rates of that moment, the whole idea was to build it all at once. And that meant that the crust, the upper crust of our ground, had to be built as a thickened slab so that that would become the staging ground of not just our building, but the Weiss-Manfredi building to our left and the Perkins and Will building to our right. And so the garage was being dug out incrementally as we were building up at the same time. This is a bottom down and top up kind of building at the same time, lodging itself, as you can see very delicately, into the ascent of the head house of the gateway that is now effectively running the long axis with the other thresholds coming from underground into the campus and the city. So the two sides crossing Main Street, the long axis of the threshold, the orientation above for the admissions, the museum to the south, the extension of the gateway angle to point back to the infinite corridor, the head houses disaggregated so that you can slalom and navigate your way through them. And then as you go down underground, that immediate connection that gets you to the railroad lines, and in section, a kind of reiteration of the idea of building from the bottom up, the head houses, and top down with a canopy that then, almost like acupuncture, negotiates the location of its needles in relationship to the public space below. The project now, 2 or 3 days after its inauguration. Being what we are, designing details as what we call the catalytic detail, we had imagined thousands of joints between these columns, the base and the capital, but of course that was ridiculous. With some of our earlier work with furniture, we realized that if this were done with either carbon fiber or fiberglass, it could be built like a wing or a boat. And so tapping into the local industries of Maine and of Rhode Island, this was brought into position with a boat and then through the Charles River and finding its place atop the columns on one fine day in September of 2022 in less than a few hours. The lifting of the first piece into place. The second piece coming into the place, you can see both the column locations that are located in there with some tolerance to wiggle around so that they can be positioned into place. And then, of course, a kind of a new datum of the public ground coincides with the yard where the kids play atop the base of our building on site 4, and then the general view that it opens up towards the Charles River, a kind of amazing manufacturing feat as a structure. It is not a weight to be held up. It is more like a sail that has to be held down. So in many ways, what the columns are doing in this case is that they're holding the canopy down. Now, as we go forward, this is also a recognition that, you know, campus life is a different public than the larger public realm that we think about when we think of the mall in Washington, D.C. or public plazas. But the America, the United States that I've grown up in the last almost 50 years, has also gone through some significant transitions, namely one of privatization. The public colleges that would have cost a couple of $100s of administrative fees are now, of course, in the tens of thousands. The airports that would serve us as a public now have private jets in them. Medicine, which would otherwise be accessible to all, has been a private project in the United States. Water, which is what we should get in abundance, is essentially bottled and will become the next big resource after oil. And you know, there are other evidences of privatization. These are the now infamous protectors of the distribution of food in Gaza. Anyway, it's not uncontroversial, all of this, but notions of checks and balances that would come with the public realm or civic responsibility are also at stake. That is not a black and white question, of course, but knowing that we live in a privatized world, the other corollary question is, how does one invert it, or how does one work with it? And in many ways, there are other precedents of that. If you think of Paley Park in New York and the ways in which a dense city may have a private space, but it becomes irreducibly necessary in the context of a city that has no respite, it becomes all the more important. The other thing is, of course, if you say that the private space doesn't allow everybody because they can kick somebody out, well, many of our spaces have already become that anyway. If colleges have their own security, that doesn't mean that they're the ones who ultimately have the final say on our campuses. And so there's a tricky terrain that we're occupying right now within the realm of how we negotiate public and private space as private security and municipal and federal forces begin to occupy vice versa. Very difficult terrain, but the colleges in which we've been operating, whether the Daniels, RISD, or in this case, Melbourne, have all gone through predicaments that involve these kinds of challenges. In the context of Melbourne, what was interesting about the project was that we inherited a site for the School of Architecture which was dead center on the campus in front of the student union and what's called the concrete lawn to the left, the main plaza. And so somehow we needed to find a way in which this monolithic box would become engageable, penetrable, and part of the urban spaces that it could sponsor on all of its sides. Composed of a neo-Georgian set of courtyards that activate the rest of the campus, there are urban rooms that essentially get reinforced by a common atrium that rests at the center of the building that becomes the main protagonist for creating what is ostensibly a vertical studio space, not unlike this space here, that became a huge way of solving a major problem. In fact, the studio space was originally conceived at the top of the building. This is before the Daniels faculty, but was value engineered within less than a month. So we looked at the net to gross area of the circulation space and said if we widen that just a little, we could create out of the budget of the FF&E the necessary program for hot spaces of desks, fabrication spaces, crit spaces, and then they get to borrow studio and exhibition spaces next door to create what is essentially an alternative to railings that are effectively making that space inhabitable. And so what happens is that whereas architecture is one floor, landscape architecture on another floor, urbanism on another floor, the infrastructures against them are consistent. So students are forced to go down and up to different floors resulting in a kind of interdisciplinary environment as people use common infrastructures but are crossing paths with each other. And whether one can actually create a vertical public space is a huge challenge. I mean, we all just came down from the third floor and the elevator becomes the de facto way of doing this. So we needed to think of informal ways in which this building needed to be activated, which we did along with the elevator. But I discovered that goats are way more nimble than we are as they climb trees. This is not Photoshop. This is the real thing. I have a thing for animals, so beginning to think like goats as we occupy the different spaces from the base of the building to other spaces, while the core of the building is anchored by strong form. The formless invades this project through many ingle nooks and moments where informal gatherings get to happen at the location of a soft ascent that connects all of these episodes together as one goes up the section of the building around what is ostensibly an important, monumental, civic, and visible icon, which is the dedicated studio spaces of the visiting critics. And, you know, this is one of those moments where we are looking also culturally at other public buildings and how they've dealt with it in the context of the Tempietto, an idealized piece of architecture within a kind of medieval fabric, isolated in its pristine perfection. In Gary's, the invocation of a fabric designed by himself as a foil for the zoomorphic figure that rests in its center, arguably the most interesting one, Khan, where the figure is inscribed in the materiality of the very structure that gives support to the museum in New Haven, something that we riffed on, but through other means. D.H. Lawrence's note, upside down at the bottom of the world, was written forlornly at the end of each of his letters home while in Australia writing Kangaroo in the 1920s. It became our appreciation of our position in the world upside down at the bottom of the world. And we wanted a figure that in some ways was inverted to how we might imagine gravity up here. And so with a formidable LVL roof, sometimes 10 feet deep, coffering that lets in natural light but not direct sun, this becomes effectively a new ground, a foundation from which an inverted tectonics is suspended and stops short of the piano nobile, where the public space rests on top. The timber is thick at the top and veneers of plywood at the bottom. It's kind of the opposite of rustication, if you will. And levity is not something that is easily communicable in the context of a lecture, but the affect of that weight composed of prefabricated pieces brought at 4 o'clock in the morning produced that thickened impact at the top and the kind of thinness of the acoustic baffles at the bottom with the kind of weightlessness that is suggested by a space that unfortunately is so successful it is now occupied by the entire campus rather than the design school, resulting in ample complaints about our design. But the space of revolution keeps coming back to my head, and it's hard not to think of the School of Design in Sao Paulo and how that became, even though it's an interior, even though it's a framed space, it became a place of protest at a critical moment. And so the public interior does factor into much of our work just because we recognize how key important spaces in New York, the Grand Central Station, but in many cities, whether they're banking halls, libraries, or whatnot, have formed a critical part of our imaginary as we've gone through the interfaith spaces of Northeastern or the RISD library that invites the Providence public into its core while it serves as a living room for the dormitories above, or the Adams Library that turns the sock inside out. Essentially, it was a library that was a bunker, and we sort of turned it all inside out to make it breathe in relationship to its neighborhood. Anyway, the kind of penetration from the Elizabeth Murdoch building into our atrium connects to a piano nobile, a second floor that opens up with the great weather of Melbourne directly out into that space and becomes one of its spaces of reception, and a very important one, as an antechamber to a street that goes all the way through it to the concrete lawn, a very important space because it connects the library, the Fab Lab, the exhibition spaces, but also penetrates up into the studio space with a discrete view. Again, the street is open 24/7, but the upper spaces are slightly more controlled as one appreciates the presence of the studio as a kind of emblematic space on top. A lawn on the southern space is aligned with the main administration building, and the heaving of the library from below produces a third figure on the outer facade, activated on the northeast by a series of bleachers that comes into dialogue with the loading dock to the north. This is a building in the round. It has no back, it has no front. It has multiple fronts and multiple backs and requires a porosity and a sensitivity to all sides, with one outlier, which is the Joseph Rindt facade. The existing building you see over there was not an existing building of this site, but a donation to the site from the Bank of I'm sorry, I forget the bank, but it was a donation as a kind of pedagogical, as a didactic instrument that was all blocked up for ages. And what we did was to open it up, essentially. And so part of that exercise was the recognition that to penetrate it, we had to document it. as a freestanding structure. It necessitated some supports or buttresses in the back, a new cladding on the interior, an identification of where the existing openings are, a penetration to activate them for light and the passage of doorways coming through it, and then giving a large buttress that connects to the structural core of the building for lateral stability. Again, all as an extension of the public realm. If you like, this is our version of the Noli plan permeating the base of the building into the interiors. So to end with, and this is a little bit sloppier because we're also going into a realm of projects which are almost planning projects, formless, and some of them that preempt form but are not form yet. But it conjures up a debate that you're all familiar with, maybe a false opposition in our minds between, Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. I say false opposition because maybe we are the victims of the appreciation of the strength, the formal strength that Moses brought to design considerations, all while at the same time ramming through neighborhoods without even thinking about who lived there, where Jane Jacobs comes in to essentially create a form of activism that sets the stage for much of what we benefit from today, from historic preservation to the different landmark commissions that we go through, many things that have to do with an understanding that the city is not merely a place, but it's a series of communities, it's a history, and it's something to be cherished in the fourth dimension, with time as a critical part of it. Now, as architects, we often think of these extraordinary spaces in which great moments are celebrated, civil rights, for instance. We're also witness to how easily those rights can be taken away from us. But what's more interesting probably is that also now we are not fighting against each other. There are technologies that surveil us. There are other means by which our footprint is controlled. So in many ways, the power of public spaces in the recognition of the civil rights in great part had to do with the power of the swarm. What I think contemporary technologies has done is been able to take the swarm and re-individualize all of us, knowing everything about us, where we've been, where we're going to, what we've posted, and in a sense, diminish the power of the swarm. So these last projects don't come with that directly in mind, but they come with other predicaments. Rikers Island, anybody who knows anything about the prison system in New York knows that you may be arrested for a small infraction, you are put into Rikers, and because your case is not reviewed for a couple of weeks, and then something happens that it's delayed for another month, you, who's done nothing, becomes the victim of another form of crime within the jail system without access to your lawyer, to your family, or to your community. So part of the justice project of decentralizing the jail systems within the context of the 5 boroughs is to bring the community of people, whether they're detainees or correction officers, but also community members, families of detainees, lawyers, business owners, educational individuals, to plan out a series of decentralized hubs where a different form is brought to justice reform. You can see here that architecture is merely an infrastructure about decentralization. In Lincoln Center, we inherited this extraordinary history of the disenfranchisement of the community in San Juan Hill, much like all of the great redevelopment projects of that time. They were tabula rasas. They completely razed lands in order to build an island, and the island of Lincoln Center turns its back on the West, opening itself only up onto Broadway. And of course, the West is where San Juan Hill was. And so our project really started at the recognition of those communities who were not recognized for over 50 years as this extraordinary complex of culture was made, and how to make that porous. Equally so, recognizing the different institutions and schools that enliven that space across generations, and of course recognize the larger connection that that has to the Hudson, currently blocked by a hat shell that turns its back on that very same community. This was not so much a design project for us, even though we did do design, but it was a participatory project that found its programs through the voices of the community, incrementalizing them over the site, while also ensuring a civic moment where that grand stair ramp brings you into a space of collection as one comes into the Lincoln campus and connects it with the broader promenade going from the west to the east, making for accessible connections all the way across, and recognizing that even then, the iconic moments are important to anchor a sense of inclusion in the context of a campus that requires a new voice. Here, with the new outdoor theater, a kind of sense that that theater is what frames now a new portal, a new threshold out towards the west. As we do this, this is the last project. It's over. You don't have to worry. We're also doing the renovation of the Met, where we're looking at different ways of recognizing the Mediterranean and the Near East, not so much as cultures divided, but that cultures that communicated with each other for centuries and need a form of representation. And there are two dominant forms of representation in museums that have to do with either the white box as a kind of purported neutral space, or the space that situates that art within purportedly their original settings. And we had to do something of the latter without the replication of those contexts by producing the affect of the materialities and the technologies of those eras without necessarily replicating their forms. And so that is a project that's in progress also. All of this comes to a head in moments where we realize that architecture still also matters. In the context of Nebraska, I like this because two cultures are brought together, the culture of football and the culture of the arts. Arguably Philip Johnson's best building, and a great football team that happened to lose on the week that I was there to watch my one football game in 20 years. Our building acts as a threshold, as a gateway to the promenade that links these two important publics, with the base of our building becoming essentially an alumni space that does a lot of the fundraising actually for the football team, creates a common court that is an outdoor classroom for what is essentially a warehouse building, a studio space above, an experiment on CLT, borrowing the infrastructure of the existing building to create a 4-detail building. Dumb, simple, brutal, but really something that finds its voice through an identity that is about these two promenades. A shingle system that looks back on the museum and from one axis and back on the stadium on the other, finding the identity of this in some way or another through these two publics that occupy this site. So with that, I try to give some sense of recognition of the publics that drive these projects and the importance of working ground up, but also securing a space where design still matters, where form and specification and a sense of delight are still a central part of what we invest in. Thank you so much.